In this video, I would like to show you how to calculate and interpret the odds ratio and the risk ratio in musculoskeletal research. The odds ratio is used in case control studies where participants are purposefully chosen based on the presence or the absence of some health outcome. An example of a health outcome may be you'll have a group of athletes with an injury and a group of athletes without injuries. We want to know something about the relationship between an exposure and some form of health outcome. There will be participants who display uncontrolled movement during the bent knee fallout test. The bent knee fallout test is done with the patient lying on the back, and then they just open and close their legs in this position, and the therapist observe movement of the pelvis. There may be uncontrolled movement present, or there may not be uncontrolled movement present. And an example of a health outcome will be injury or no injury that's being sustained. So here's your 2x2 contingency table. You have a group of injured participants and a group of non-injured participants. You also have a group of athletes who display uncontrolled movement and a group of athletes who do not display uncontrolled movement. Now first, before you can calculate the odds ratio, you need to calculate the odds. So the odds of exposure amongst the injured athletes is the injured with uncontrolled movement divided by the injured without uncontrolled movement. And you'll see it's A over C, or 11 over 2. Here you will see A over C, or 11 over 2. Those in the injured group who displayed uncontrolled movement divided by those in the injured group who did not display any uncontrolled movement. Now the odds of exposure amongst the non-injured athletes. You'll take B divided by D, or the non-injured with uncontrolled movement divided by the non-injured without uncontrolled movement, B over D, or 5 over 14. So here you will see the non-injured group, 5 over 14, or B over D. So it's the non-injured participants who displayed uncontrolled movement divided by the non-injured participants who had no uncontrolled movement. And from there onwards, you go on and you calculate the odds ratio. So the odds ratio is the odds of exposure in the injured group over the odds of exposure in the non-injured group. And here you will see the A divided by C, which you have calculated in the previous slide, and the B over D that you've calculated in the previous slide. The A over C and the B over D, the odds. So it's the odds divided by the odds. Odds of the exposure in the injured divided by the odds of exposure in the non-injured. This is just the mathematical formula that's derived from this formula. And you replace the letters with numbers, and we get to the odds ratio. So the odds of presenting with uncontrolled movement are 15.4 times higher in an injured than in a non-injured athlete. An odds ratio of more than 1 means that the athlete with uncontrolled movement is more likely to have an injury than those without uncontrolled movement. An odds ratio of less than 1 means the athlete with uncontrolled movement is less likely to have an injury than those without uncontrolled movement. And an odds ratio of 1 means there's no difference between those with or without uncontrolled movement in terms of injury. Remember to have a look at the 95 confidence interval as well. A 95 confidence interval which crosses 1 means that the finding is not statistically significant and that the finding could have occurred by chance. And you can't base any of your assumptions on that finding. The risk ratio, or the relative risk, is a measure of relative effect in cohort studies. So it's the likelihood that someone exposed to a risk factor will develop a health outcome over a period of time. So it takes into account the incidence of injury. Risk ratio is the ratio of the incidence of a health outcome among those exposed to a risk factor to the incidence of the health outcome among the unexposed. So let's say we have a group of athletes. They're all injury-free at the start of the sports season. And while they're all injury-free, you test them for an uncontrolled movement during the bent knee fallout test, all at the start of the season. Then you follow them up and you monitor the incidence of injuries during the sports season, whether they've sustained an injury or not during the sports season. You have your contingency table again. Here you have the athletes who sustained an injury during the season, and here you have the athletes who did not sustain an injury during the season. Some of them displayed uncontrolled movement, and some of them did not present with uncontrolled movement at the start of the season. First, you need to calculate the risk in order to calculate the risk ratio. So the risk of having a health outcome is the number of people with a specific health outcome over the total number of people. So the risk of injury if an athlete displayed an uncontrolled movement means A over A plus B, 11 over 11 plus 5, which means A over A plus B. So the number of participants who displayed uncontrolled movement amongst the injured participants over the total number of people who displayed uncontrolled movement. And the risk of, we get to 69%. So the risk of injury if an athlete displayed an uncontrolled movement is 69%. And the risk of injury in an athlete who did not display an uncontrolled movement is also calculated. And that's C over C plus D, or 2 over 2 plus 14. 2, the number of injured athletes who displayed uncontrolled movement, divided by the number of non-injured athletes who displayed uncontrolled movement, plus the number of injured athletes, so the total number of participants who displayed uncontrolled movement. So it's 2 over 16. So here we got to the risk, and we have another risk which we're going to divide it by. So the risk ratio is the risk of a health outcome with the exposure divided by the risk of a health outcome without the exposure. And we get to a risk ratio of 5.31, which means that the risk to sustain an injury if an uncontrolled movement is present during the bent knee fallout is 5.31 times higher than when an uncontrolled movement is not present. So here you can see where this comes from. We have the risk of an injury in an athlete who displayed uncontrolled movement, and that is divided by the risk of an injury if an athlete did not display uncontrolled movement. So to go back to this slide, here's the risk of the health outcome with exposure, A over A plus B, and C over C plus D. A risk ratio of more than 1 means that uncontrolled movement increases the risk to sustain an injury. Less than 1 means uncontrolled movement decreases the risk to sustain an injury. A risk ratio of 1 means displaying uncontrolled movement does not pose a risk to injury. And remember to look at the confidence interval. If the 95% confidence interval crosses 1, then the finding is not statistically significant and could have occurred by chance.